Thank you so much, Mindy. It's really wonderful to be here with all of you today. I appreciate you taking the time from your days to attend. I was slated to give this talk in person back in March at the Academy building in Golden Gate Park, and I regret that we couldn't all be there together, but of course the coronavirus had other plans for us. But I'm really grateful to be here today. It's a bit odd to do this because I can't see any of you, but thank you for following along at home nonetheless. As Mindy said, I'm going to talk about a book that I published last fall called On the Backs of Tortoises, Darwin, the Galápagos, and the Fate of an Evolutionary Eden. But before I dive into the research that I've done on the Galápagos, I thought I would tell you a little bit about myself and how I got lucky enough to do this for my job. Since 2014, I've been a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I am in 3 different departments here in Madison, where I am today. I'm in history of science, and the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies. And before I was here in Madison, I did my PhD in geography at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And while I was a grad student at Chapel Hill, I got the opportunity to go to the Galápagos because another professor in my department was starting a big collaboration with an Ecuadorian university in the islands, and they wanted social scientists to come along. And so by that twist of fate, I had been slated to do a very different dissertation project, but I really fell in love with Galápagos. And now for the last 13 years, I have been working in and about the islands, which has been really fortunate. My research has been funded by the National Science Foundation, the Social Science Research Council, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the Rachel Carson Center in Germany. Now, I'm a geographer, as I mentioned, and an environmental historian. And that means that I'm interested in how human perceptions of and ways of interacting with the natural world change over time. And so the Galápagos was a really fascinating place to be able to do that kind of research, because popular opinion about the archipelago and its value has changed dramatically over the last 300 years. For centuries, the islands were known to explorers, to buccaneers, and to whalers who were sailing the Pacific as a storehouse of natural resources. They were known for their water, for timber, and above all for the giant tortoises, which were considered a most delicious source of fresh meat and fat. In fact, in the 16th century, Spanish sailors actually named the archipelago for its tastiest resources. Galápago is actually an old Spanish word for tortoise. But today, of course, the hundreds of thousands of tourists who visit the islands, up until this year at least, they wouldn't dream of eating tortoises. The animals are now seen as charismatic endangered species. They're icons of conservation in a place that's often called the natural laboratory of evolution. And that, of course, is in part due to a young man named Charles Darwin. There we go. I imagine you all know that Darwin visited the Galápagos during the Beagle voyage. It was in 1835 that he was in the islands for only 5 weeks. But what he saw there and the specimens that he collected, particularly the finches and the mockingbirds, helped to inspire his theory of evolution by natural selection. But I'm not going to talk about finches today, because of course my book is about giant tortoises, which are, if you're not familiar, they're land animals, they're not swimmers, even though this guy is hanging out in a pond. And I want to talk about why they are so iconic in the Galápagos. And then I will dive in and tell you stories of 2 different species of Galápagos giant tortoises. There are 15 total species in the archipelago, or there once were. But I'm going to start by telling you an old story that's actually not about the Galápagos. Maybe some of you know this story. I've heard it many times now, and I think it's as likely legend as true. And so I'm going to read a little bit from the book as I talk today. So this story supposedly took place in an auditorium or university lecture hall in the early 20th century, where the philosopher William James stood before a crowded room giving a talk on recent theories of cosmology. At the end of the lecture, as members of the audience started asking questions, an elderly woman in the back made her way to the front of the room. When her turn to speak came, she declared, Your talk was very interesting, Mr. James, but it is wrong. We all know that the earth really rests on the back of a turtle. And James kind of raised his eyebrows, but nodded respectfully and replied, but then what does the turtle stand on? And the old lady replied, oh, that's easy. The turtle stands on the back of a second, far larger turtle. Amused, James persisted to see what might happen if he asked one more time. Well, what does that second turtle stand on? And the old woman smiled and shook her head and said, very clever, Mr. James, but it's turtles all the way down. Every time I've heard that story, the teller interprets it somewhat differently. How are we supposed to understand the old woman's claim that the world rests on the backs of turtles? What is it about this story that makes it so often told? The old woman's insistence on the stack of turtles makes the story memorable. And for some readers today, it may be amusing, partly because the stack of turtles seems like something out of a Dr. Seuss story. But we laugh a little uneasily at the punchline because it invites us to doubt our own certainties. Do we really know that the old woman is wrong? In a number of non-Western cultures, turtles play foundational roles in origin stories. In drawing a contrast between two ways of knowing the world, the story points to a deeper truth about the ground we stand on, the things we take for granted without really knowing them to be true. Take, for instance, how the physicist Stephen Hawking interpreted the story to introduce his brief history of time. In a book that explains research on some of the most challenging contemporary questions about the nature of the universe, from the Big Bang to black holes, Hawking opens with the old woman and her turtles to remind readers that the basis for our knowledge of the cosmos may turn out to be not much sturdier than her tower of turtles. But we may find her claim to be ridiculous, he writes, but why do we think we know better? Our knowledge is uncertain, Hawking reminds us, and always a work in progress. The ground on which we stand is not as solid as we might like to imagine. Yet still we must proceed, keeping track of our uncertainty so that we remain open to new questions and new ways of understanding the world. Now, this Turtles All the Way Down story is a tale, it's a metaphor, but the book that I wrote is actually about a real place where I think the old woman's claim rings true. For the Galápagos, the world as we know it does rest on the backs not of turtles, but of giant tortoises. Now, I don't mean that literally, of course, and I don't mean that anyone who lives in the Galápagos believes that literally either. But what I do mean is that these land-dwelling animals have fundamentally shaped the history of the islands. The Galápagos just wouldn't be the same place without them. The giant tortoises are today charismatic icons of conservation, but they're also much more than that. I've been visiting the islands for more than a decade now, and the more I return, the more deeply I'm struck by the many meanings and roles that the tortoises carry. What it means to rest on their backs is far more complicated, ethically ambiguous, and fascinating than I could have imagined when I first stepped ashore. And I want to tell you some stories today to explain a little bit about why I think that is true. So I'm going to illustrate this with these two different tortoise stories. And now, as you can see on this map, there are 13 large islands in the Galápagos and 100 or more small islands. And these islands were once home to 15 different species of giant tortoises. Now, 4 of those species went extinct because of predation by sailors and island colonists over the last couple of hundred years. Or at least that's what we thought until recently. And you might have seen the news last winter when an Animal Planet expedition to Fernandina Island, which is on the left part of your screen, the westernmost island, they turned up one lone female tortoise, and it was the first tortoise that had been found on that island in 115 years. And so that species was not actually extinct. It was actually also only the second tortoise ever to be found on that island. So extinction isn't always as permanent as we think it is, and I'll come back to that point in my talk today. But to explain this map a little bit more, all of the islands that are shaded in the dark gray are where there are extant or existing tortoise species today, and the lighter gray islands are where tortoise species have gone extinct. The white islands never had a tortoise species to begin with. And so the tortoise species that I'm going to tell you the story of are from Santiago Island, where the species is called Darwini after Darwin, and Floriana Island in the central south part of the archipelago, where the species is called Niger. So first up, the Santiago Island tortoises, named for a friend Charles Darwin. And these tortoises were named in 1907 by a man named John Vandenberg, who was the curator of herpetology at the Cal Academy. I regret that I don't have a photograph of Vandenberg, but he wanted to memorialize Darwin with the species name. And that was something that scientists and taxonomists often did, would name species after friends, colleagues, or their predecessors. And the Santiago tortoises today are one of many things in the Galápagos that are named for Darwin. There's a research station. There are a couple of streets in the islands named for him. And I've also met several young boys named Darwin in the archipelago as well. If you've been to the Galápagos, you know that Darwin is heroized as the patron saint of Galápagos science and conservation, and you run into him, it seems, literally everywhere in the islands. Here he is on an arch at the end of Darwin Avenue, near, very close to the entrance to the national park. And his face, if you can't see it, is kind of godlike up in heaven, watching down over these Galápagos creatures. I also have run into him in his office on the left here at the Charles Darwin Research Station. And we had coffee together at a cafe once a couple of years ago. He looks really worried in all of these images. I'm not quite sure why he's depicted that way. But one thing about the Darwins in the Galápagos is that they're almost always depicted with this big gray beard. You know, they're images of Darwin as the wise old sage who crafted the concept of evolution. But that, I think, is a far cry from the Darwin who actually walked the island's hills back in 1835. So I want to tell you about Darwin's experience on Santiago that inspired Vandenberg to name those tortoises for him. I'm going to read another section here. So on a sunny day in October 1835, a 26-year-old Darwin hiked from the parched coast of Santiago Island to the island's green, damp highlands, where he was taken with the giant tortoises he found. After a long walk, he sat in the shade and watched them as they ambled along broad roads that had been trodden by their elephant-like feet over countless generations. He timed their gait faster than he supposed, measured their carapaces, 6 and 8 feet in circumference, and tried to lift them, some weigh well over 500 pounds. Finding their weight too much, he climbed aboard, rapping on their shells and trying not to slip off their backs as they trudged along. Riding tortoises is today, of course, not one among the approved ways of following in Darwin's footsteps in the Galápagos. Tourists can observe the animals that Darwin saw, but they're not permitted to do as he did. Recreating the experiences of the Darwin who actually walked the islands would mean doing a host of things that are now prohibited by national park rules, trying to net birds with your hat, or catching iguanas by the tail and dissecting their stomachs to see what they eat. Perhaps worst of all would be doing what Darwin did after a day spent observing the tortoises, feasting on them. In the highlands of Santiago, Darwin spent 2 days camping with local tortoise hunters, during which time he subsisted on nothing but the animals. The Spaniard hunters, as Darwin called them, were political exiles from the new state of Ecuador who were collecting meat for a colony on Floriana Island. I'll tell you a little bit more about that colony in a bit. For dinner, they made tortoise carne con cuero in the style of Argentinian gauchos. They roasted meat on the breastplate and frying it in tortoise fat. Jotting down his impression of the meal afterward, Darwin deemed it very good, although he preferred a capital soup made of young tortoises. So Darwin ate the tortoises that now are named after him, but Vandenberg, of course, didn't write that part of the story into his description of why he named the species after Darwin. He instead focused on the natural history observations. And I wanted to tell that story because of the connection to the Cal Academy, but it's also really important because it was Vandenberg who published the first monograph that established that there were 15 different tortoise species or races in the Galápagos. He called them races back in the early 20th century. And when Darwin was in the Galápagos, both the vice governor of the Floriana colony and the tortoise hunters told him but they could tell what island a tortoise came from because they all looked different. In retrospect, that was a huge hint about evolution, but at the time, Darwin didn't pay much attention to it, and he wrote about regretting that later in his life. So unlike the finches, he didn't collect tortoises as natural history specimens. The beagle only took them aboard as a source of food. So it was Vandenberg's monograph in 1914 that vindicated what the colonists and Darwin thought to be true, that each island had different species. And this specimen that you can see pictured here, number 8109, is the type specimen from Santiago that is stored in a back room at the Cal Academy still today. It is the animal that Vandenberg measured and described when he named the species. And so the next story I'm going to tell you is about how Vandenberg got that species. This is another significant piece of Academy history because this tortoise was one of 266 giant tortoises that were captured during the Cal Academy's 1905-1906 Galápagos expedition. As many of you may know, that my friend Matt James has written a book all about this expedition. It's called Collecting Evolution. And his book chronicles the 366 days that this team of 9 men spent in the Galápagos. I'm going to tell a very short piece of that story, which is about the day 9 months into their stay in July 1906, that Rollo Beck, who was the expedition leader, and the ship's herpetologist, whose name was Arthur Slevin, who went on to be the curator of herpetology at the Academy later in his life. And so the account I have is taken from Slevin's journal, which is also in the Academy's archive, and which has been, like all the journals from this trip, transcribed by volunteer Barbara West. So I want to say thank you, Barbara. If you're out there, you've made my job so much easier. And so on this expedition, Beck, it was actually his 4th expedition to the Galápagos. The prior trips he'd taken had been sponsored by Lord Walter Rothschild of the British banking family. Feel free to ask me about him in Q&A. There's some interesting Rothschild stories. But Beck knew that he needed to get tortoises from all of the different populations in the Galápagos. And he had been to Santiago previously and not found tortoises there. He'd actually found the remains from the camp that the tortoise hunters used to use, but there weren't any tortoises in that vicinity anymore. And so the day that he and Slevin were there, they hiked further inland in order to find tortoises. And so the account that I'm going to read is from Slevin's journal, as I mentioned. Slevin wrote, "The country is extremely rough, the worst we've encountered since we arrived in Islands. The lava flows are all comparatively recent, and many places have no vegetation whatever. There is no earth whatever here. Everything is lava, and it's impossible to do any trailing of the tortoises." The following day, though, Beck and another collector, Ernest King, found 2 large male tortoises in better tortoise country, where the lava had eroded into dirt, and there were cacti for tortoises to feed on. Slevin helped King prepare the animals, skinning them by dissecting them and cleaning out their internal organs, scraping meat and fat from their skin and bones. For the largest tortoises, which were too heavy to carry alive and whole, the men often fixed them on land. Smaller tortoises they could take aboard to live in a pen on the ship's deck until Slevin had time to prepare them. Well, that day, while Slevin and King skinned, Beck continued searching, eventually finding 3 more tortoises. The men hauled these 5 tortoises back to shore in the same way that earlier sailors had. They backed down smaller tortoises on their shoulders, or they strapped larger tortoises to poles that were shouldered by 2 or more men, as you can see in this figure. Slevin wrote of having to leave 1 tortoise for the night. The country was so rough and hard to get over that our shoulders became so sore that we could not hold the tortoise up any longer. These Santiago tortoises, Slevin wrote, had the heaviest shells and bones of any taken by us and were very fat. This was really incredibly difficult labor that was essential for Vandenberg's taxonomic work. And I think it's important to note, because we don't always think about these kind of behind the scenes players in the naming of species or in stories about evolution. And because Beck and Slevin took really good notes about where they found tortoises and how many they found on each island, Vandenberg was actually the first to write about the animal's survival status. There were some species like those on Floriana that were extinct in 1914, to rare like the ones on Santiago, but then other populations like those on southern Isabella Island were he deemed very abundant. Now, up until this point, scientists had tried to save tortoises by collecting and taxidermying specimens for museums. And this is an image of Rollo Beck finishing tortoise taxidermy prep in 1899. But Vandenberg's monograph was a turning point for the animals because it was in the 1920s and 1930s that scientists first began campaigning to establish a national park in the Galápagos and put more emphasis on trying to save living tortoises. Today, the Santiago tortoises remain classified as critically endangered, but the population is growing, and that is due to the efforts of the National Park Guards who run the giant tortoise breeding center on Santa Cruz Island that is named for Don Fausto Urena, who is the man in the upper left-hand picture. And Don Fausto is a park guard who worked with the tortoises in this breeding center for more than 30 years. There are 3 of these different breeding centers across the island now, but the one in Santa Cruz was the first one. It was established in 1965, right after the Darwin Research Station and the National Park were founded. And while I was doing research in the archipelago back in 2011, I volunteered for a month at the breeding center. And so you can see here, I got to go to work feeding the animals. You can see Don Fausto and then myself in the lower image carting around wheelbarrows full of greens that the big tortoises eat. And then on the photograph on the right, Don Fausto, another volunteer, and I are scrubbing the wading pool of the tortoise Lonesome George, who you can see in the background. So it wasn't all very glamorous work. About 80 tortoises lived at this breeding center, 80 adult tortoises and hundreds of baby tortoises while I was there. And I also got to help out with the breeding aspect of the work that they do because it was nesting season during the month that I was volunteering. And so the females living in captivity, when they were ready to lay their eggs, they would dig out with their hind legs these big holes you can see in this image, a kind of emptied out hole, and they would lay their eggs, and then they would cover the dirt back on and then urinate on top of it, and the urine would dry the mud and make a really solid cap to protect the eggs. But what the keepers would do is that after the female tortoise had gone through all of that, they would go a couple days later and actually dig up those eggs and take them into an incubation chamber to stay for 3 or 4 months until they were ready to hatch, so they would ensure better survival rates for these hatchlings. Now, one morning near the end of my time as a volunteer, they said it was my turn to try and excavate one of these tortoise nests. Now, I had been helping mostly up to this point by taking pictures while they did this. And so this was something new for me, to be actually handed the machete that you can see under the one park guard Daniel's knee there. It's about as big as his forearm. It was very dull. And so they handed it to me and said it was my turn. So nervously, I went to work trying to pry the cap off of this tortoise nest. And eventually, with a lot more effort than either of them had shown, I eventually got it off. It was about a foot wide and 6 inches deep. And underneath were 13 white eggs, one of which I seemed to have broken with the machete. So I worried about the consequences of my inexperience, but they said I shouldn't. Actually, they told the other volunteer and I to just go ahead and throw the eggs from this nest into the forest behind the corral. Now, I hesitated because I was sure I had misunderstood their Spanish or that they were pranking me, because why were we not treating these eggs, the new potential life of a prized endangered species, with the same care as all of the other eggs that I had seen them excavate over the weeks? But goaded on, I pitched an egg toward the cactus, missed the first time, And then we took turns disposing of the eggs from this nest. I hit the cactus on my third try, and I watched the egg's yellow yolk drip down the trunk, feeling unsettled. Afterward, we walked back toward the office, and Don Fausto explained to me that these tortoises, which were living in a corral that was way in the back of the breeding center out of public view, were actually a new breeding group from Floriana Island. Now, this was pretty astounding news because the Floriana species had been extinct since the 1840s. But it turned out that over the past few years, geneticists had actually found an extinct this extinct species. And so they had found that there were survivors or descendants from tortoises that were originally from Floriana living both on Volcan Wolf, which you can see circled here up at the northern part of Isabella Island. And there are also some living in captivity at the breeding center, unbeknownst to keepers. They'd been there for decades. So those tortoises at the breeding center had been collected from island settlers in the 1960s. And conservationists, when they collected them, they didn't know, and the colonists didn't know exactly where the tortoises had come from which island. And so they didn't want them to interbreed and like mix up the different species. And so they kept them in the breeding center, not as breeding population, but they separated them by sex and put them in different corrals and just kind of fed them and kept them captive for 50 years. And so when the geneticists found that there were some descendants from Floriana in that population, they pulled them out and put them in the corral where I encountered them and disposed of their eggs. But as Don Fausto had told me, it was an experimental year. They didn't know how well these tortoises would be able to reproduce after 50 years. And they had already, unbeknownst to me, stocked the incubators with other eggs from these tortoises. But a lot of them, like the ones that we found, were oblong instead of round. They were kind of misshapen, and the shells were too thin. And so Don Fausto knew that they weren't going to produce viable offspring, which is why we were able to pitch them away. So I want to tell you a bit more about how the conservationists and geneticists rediscovered this extinct Floriana species, because I think it's a pretty incredible story. And the genetics plays a really important role. And so since the mid-2000s, a team of geneticists that's headquartered at Yale University have been going to the islands and taking blood samples to get DNA of tortoises all across the archipelago. And by doing that, they can compare the genetic markers of these different species, and they can figure out how the species diversified from one island to the other. There was one original tortoise populator that came in from continental South America about 3 million years ago. And then over the past million years, that animal had diversified across the archipelago into these 15 different species. And so in effect, the genetics is proving what Darwin thought to be true about tortoise evolution. Now, in 2008, the national park did a big expedition to Volcan Wolf up at the north part of Isabella, and to take more blood samples. And this isn't a place that lots of folks visit on land. And so when the geneticists got the DNA from these tortoises on Volcan Wolf, they noticed some really odd patterns in them. And they realized that there were tortoises that had hybridized between the Floriana species and the species called Becky, which is native to Volcan Wolf. But what's really interesting is the timeline about this. Or first I'll tell you, they knew that the tortoises were from Floriana because they were able to also extract DNA from bone fragments that had been collected from caves in Floriana in 1928 and stored at the American Museum of Natural History in New York and the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard. And so they had like original Floriana DNA that they could use as a comparison in these databases. And so that's how they figured out that there were still tortoises with some Floriana DNA living in the Galápagos. But then the question, of course, becomes, how did these Floriana tortoises get from an island in the south of the archipelago clear across to the northwest part of the archipelago? And what's really interesting about the evolutionary timeline from the genetic analysis is that these Floriana hybrids were not hundreds of thousands of years old like the other species. They were only a couple generations mixed, and so they're about 300 years old, they estimated. And that timeline aligns with the period when the Galápagos was frequently visited by explorers and whalers. So the most likely explanation is that sailors actually moved tortoises between the islands. Looking back at the historical record, there's no direct account of this translocation from Floriana to Volcán Wolf, but there's a story in the narrative of US Captain David Porter, who was in the Galápagos during the War of 1812, that supports this theory. Porter was trying to capture British whalers up near Volcán Wolf, and he wrote of finding 50 tortoises bobbing in the sea one morning near Banks Bay, which is kind of in the neck of the seahorse shape of Isabella. And it was the morning after his ships had given chase to this British whaler. And so what had happened is that as the British ships were trying to flee, not be captured, they threw a bunch of tortoises they had on deck overboard to lighten their load. And so the thought is that under similar circumstances, other tortoises might not have stayed bobbing in the ocean, but might have drifted ashore, or other sailors might actually have put them directly ashore, maybe with the intention of coming back to get them later. And that this is probably how these species were introduced to each other. So it's a really strange twist of fate that the histories of the exploitation of the tortoises inadvertently have contributed to saving this species by creating the opportunity to revive it today. So in 2015, park guards returned to Volcán Wolf, and this time they brought 30 of these hybrid tortoises with some Floriana ancestry back to the breeding center. And you can see one of them here. And these tortoises were much more successful breeders than the ones that I had encountered. And you can see a couple of their hatchlings as well. And so far, in I think 2019, 19 different juvenile tortoises were actually returned to Floriana, where they live in semi-captivity in an enclosed area. It's quite large up in the highlands of the island, and they are part of a much larger restoration program on Floriana that I'm also happy to chat about. So in conclusion, I wanted to share with you these stories about Santiago and Floriana tortoises because I think they show a much more complicated history of human relationships with wildlife than we often hear about in the Galápagos. I think a lot of us are introduced to the Galápagos, especially in North America, for the first time through nature documentaries, and they are often very beautiful, but they don't often have great histories that are narrated. They tend to focus on broad brushstrokes and tell these histories in which the Galápagos were largely untouched for millions of years, and then sailors and island colonists arrive with devastating effects for wildlife. And that story is not wrong, but it's not very right either. The colonists who lived in the Galápagos when Darwin visited made important contributions to his research, and Darwin ate the tortoises just like they did. Natural history collectors also contributed to population decline, and in the most unexpected twist, these sailors even inadvertently helped make possible the de-extinction of the Floriana species. So I will stop there for today, but I hope that you have enjoyed some of these unusual stories from Galápagos. So I'm happy to take questions now.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Hennessy. For those of you on the call, if you have any questions, feel free to enter into the chat. I think that's the best and easiest way for us to track. But I'll kick us off. I had a question for you about I think you had mentioned that you did much of your research on site at our building here in Golden Gate Park, and I was just wondering, sort of from a personal perspective, what that felt like for you to be sort of looking at artifacts from some of our early expeditions, seeing the specimens that are hidden behind our conference room walls in some cases, and just from a personal perspective, what was that like?
I mean, it's really incredible. That's like one of the real joys of being a historian, is to be able to go and kind of immerse yourself in the artifacts of people who lived more than 100 years before me. And, you know, many of those men were just a little bit younger than I was when they were doing their Galápagos work. And so it's really cool to try and relate to them through their artifacts, and like seeing these big journals and the like fountain pens that they wrote them with. It was also really incredible to be able to go in the back room where the tortoises are stored. They're all kept in these giant plastic bags and in boxes now, because they used arsenic to preserve them, and so they're a health hazard for us, which is why not a lot of them are on the floor for public consumption today. But it's really amazing to go, and I mean, it's kind of sad in some ways, because you see these animals that I'm much more used to seeing alive after working in the breeding center and being in Galápagos, but to be able to see them dried and to think about how difficult it must have been for someone like Vandenberg, who never himself went to Galápagos, but was able to like make all of these classifications, even based on just the carapace or like the dried neck and legs of some of these animals.
Great, thank you. We have a question. Alyssa asks, when did people stop eating the Galápagos tortoise? And then she's also asking about the Academy's current involvement, which you might know of, or I might be able to follow up with afterwards.
Sure. I don't know tons about the Academy's current involvement with tortoises, but I know that there are other projects in Galápagos that I'm sure Mindy can tell us about. There are two different answers I'm going to give about when people stopped eating Galápagos tortoises. The first is that most folks, by the 1959 is when the Darwin Research Station and the National Park were founded. And by then, most folks weren't really eating them very much. And so the conservationists who came then did do education campaigns with local residents. And at that point, a lot of local residents kept tortoises as a pet on their land. And you can still see in some farms like big pens where the tortoises would have been kept, but they were eaten very occasionally and really only for special occasions. So there are a lot of myths still in Galápagos storytelling about how if you eat a tortoise, it'll make you really virile, or it will make you live a really long time because they live to be like 150, 200 years old. But it's usually, you know, for Christmas, for people's birthdays, also sometimes for postnatal women, they would eat tortoises because they thought it was a great source of nutrients. But most people at that point were subsisting on goats that were hunted, that were feral, cattle, and fish in the archipelago. The second answer that I will give is that there are still folks in the Galápagos that eat tortoises. Most of them live in one island in particular. And I think that they do it now more out of spite about national park rules than anything else, because there's a lot of available food on the islands from other sources now.
Great, thank you.
Mindy, I'll let you chat.
Oh, I should mention that the Academy continues to have a very deep relationship with scientists on the Galápagos Islands, and I'm happy to share in a follow-up email, I'll share some links to our website where you can see videos on the type of conservation work we're working on today. Let's see, I will get to that donation question for sure at the end of this call. One question from Carol is, how can the influx of tourists to the islands be prevented from impacting the wildlife? I understand the numbers of tourists are increasing.
Yeah, they are increasing up until this year, and then there was a solid stop, like all of our tourism. To give you a little bit of data about this, tourism in Galápagos has been, you know, in some ways Darwin was a tourist too, and so there have been tourists in Galápagos for ages. But it really started in the early 1970s when about 5,000 people went in a year. Last year, more than 275,000 people went in Galápagos. So there's been a dramatic increase in the number of tourists. I actually think that the tourists are pretty well controlled in the Galápagos, and especially in comparison with some Caribbean islands. So every 16 tourists in the Galápagos has to have a naturalist guide with them. A lot of tourists do cruise-based tourism, and so it's easy for the national park then to assign visitor sites. Every cruise ship now follows a really distinct itinerary through the archipelago, and they have specific times where they can be at specific places. And that really helps to control the impact and be sure that people aren't like picking up rocks or, you know, like putting an iguana in their backpack or anything while they're there. The other kind of tourism that has really increased in the last 10 years in particular is land-based tourism. And it sometimes gets a really bad flack from conservationists, I think somewhat unfairly. And that's because it's much more difficult for them to control folks when you are staying in hotels or in Airbnbs in people's homes. And folks who are doing that are often taking day trips out by boat to different islands, or they will go up in the highlands. There are some farms where you can go see tortoises in the wild. But it's much more difficult to control. The flip side of that is that much more of the money from that kind of tourism stays in the islands and actually goes to the people who live in the islands, opposed to the people who own these giant cruise ships. So there's a real trade-off in the way of thinking about how to do conservation and manage tourists. A lot of people think that the number of tourists who are allowed into the Galápagos every year is limited, and that's actually not true. The number of beds on cruise ships is limited, and so that is somewhat of a limiting factor, but there's been a moratorium now on the building of new hotels, which I think is a good idea. But you know, those hotels aren't nearly to capacity yet, and so there is capacity for more people to be going. The one thing that has been part of a big debate recently in the Galápagos is increasing the entrance fee to the national park. So right now, every foreigner who is not from South America who goes into the national park, like you get off the airplane and immediately you pay $100 entrance fee. And there have been discussions, it's been that way for more than 25 years, I think. They haven't increased the price. And so there's a lot of discussion about like, yeah, now it's probably time to increase that. Some folks say it should be $1,000 a head to enter. Some folks say maybe $200, $250. And I think that, you know, I'm not part of these debates, it's not my decision, but I think it's a real issue about access to the islands and to think about who the islands are for. Are they for, you know, only the very elite luxury tourists who could afford to spend $1,000 a head on top of the $5,000 that a cruise costs in Galápagos? Or should it be a place that really is open to more of a global public and a much better price point for more people?
That's fascinating. Thank you. We have a similar question from Kristen and Kim about the population today of tortoises compared to 50 years ago. What are the numbers today? Are they making a comeback or still decreasing?
That's a great question. I should have mentioned this. The scientists today, I work with someone really closely at the Environmental Studies and Forestry School at Syracuse, and he has worked on tortoise population counts and does a lot of modeling too of past landscape change and like what the landscape would have looked like, you know, 100 years ago, 500 years ago, and how many tortoises that landscape might have supported. And so his estimates is that the Galápagos once had 300,000 tortoises living there at a time. He thinks that today we're at about 10% of that, so about 30,000 tortoises living in the wild. That, I mean, obviously that is an enormous reduction, but over the last 50 years, it is actually coming back quite a bit. And one of the really interesting things about digging into the history of conservation in Galápagos and talking to a lot of the old park guards, you know, I talked to some of the park guards who went out and did these tortoise surveys in the 1970s, and everybody thought that like there were almost no tortoises left at that point. It was all like, you always hear these kind of the crisis rhetoric of conservation, right? We need money because these animals are so endangered and they're so extinct. And there's definitely some truth in that, but these park guards would go out, and a couple times repeatedly on different islands, they would come across tortoises where they thought that the tortoises were just completely extinct. And so this idea of rediscovering extinct species is actually something that's happened throughout the history of Galápagos. And so I think several of the island's population numbers are much stronger than folks would have thought they would be. And the other great thing is that the breeding center where I worked has raised more than 10,000 juvenile tortoises over the last 40 years and repatriated them to their home islands. The scientist that I work with in Syracuse, thinks that about half of those juvenile tortoises usually survive in situ, and that sounds pretty dismal, but it's actually, for wildlife reintroduction, it's actually a really good statistic. So in a lot of places, in one island, Española, which was down to only 14 animals in the 1960s, they have now actually closed out the breeding program a couple of years ago because they have been able to breed so many, and the juveniles that they've repatriated now are old enough and they're breeding in situ. And so they think that that population is like well on its way to establishing itself at a healthy size for the island. So it's really a success story in the conservation world.
I saw that in the legend on the map you shared earlier, the word retorticed, and I loved that. I loved that word.
That's what they call it in Galápagos, yeah, these retorticing of islands.
That's great. I think we have one more question before we wrap up here. James is asking, what are ideas about how animals first got to the islands or from island to island?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. I write about this in the book too, because there were big debates about this in the decades after Darwin published On the Origin of Species, because his idea of evolution was like, it required such an immense time period for evolution to have happened that a lot of folks were just like, there's just no way. But it also required this incredible amount of chance that a tortoise, or like at the very least to populate the islands from the tortoise species from South America, you would need one pregnant female tortoise, or maybe two, a male and a female, to start. And so it's 600 miles from the continent to the Galápagos. It's open ocean, and the currents are very strong. And so basically the thought is that tortoises would have washed out probably after an El Nino season on these kind of mats of like debris and balsa wood and so they would have just like floated all the way out to the island, happened to land on the shore on a place where they could, like on a beach where they could walk up. A lot of the shores in Galápagos are these really steep cliffs, and just happened to land there and be able to find food and reproduce themselves. So, I mean, that must have happened with thousands of tortoises, and then just a few were actually lucky enough to colonize the islands. Back in the day, folks also thought there might have been a land bridge from Panama and Costa Rica down to Galápagos. That is not true. That never existed. You can see now if you look at the ocean floor. But that was how folks at the time were like, oh, there's no way they floated out there. They must have walked. There must have been a bridge at some point, but there wasn't.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Professor Hennessy. We have lots of people in the chat thanking you for the excellent talk, and many people suggesting that, a couple of people suggesting that we continue to have these talks online even after the building reopens. And I should say to everyone that is the plan, because they have been quite popular, and we have a couple talks planned for the month of October. So make sure you're checking your email and send me a note if you think I don't have your correct email. I'm happy to update it in the system. Look for a survey tomorrow that will help us inform these programs going forward. I'll include links about the work that we do today in the Galápagos, as well as a link to purchase on the Backs of Tortoises that you're seeing here. I wanted to thank Professor Hennessy again for taking the time out of her day, or evening actually, just a couple of hours ahead of me. And thank you all members. We look forward to seeing you again. Thank you for your membership support. And in response to the person who asked about donations, your membership support is a very key part of supporting the Academy. You're continuing to help us survive and thrive during the closure, where we're taking such a huge financial hit. So thanks again, everyone saying thank you, Elizabeth, and take care.
Thanks so much, Mindy. Thanks, everyone.